Great. Hi, Patrick. Thanks so much for participating in our Just Research Q&A. If you're listening in, these conversations are new this year and provide the what and why of our written publications in an audio format. We know that learning requires all mediums, and most folks just don't have time to read long form reports. So we're trying this on, and if they're received well, we'll continue to produce them. That said, they're designed to be high level. So if you're interested in learning more, we definitely encourage you to explore the full reports. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Patrick O'Brien, the report author of two reports we'll be discussing that were released last week at our 23rd Tax and Budget Forum. If you're unfamiliar with our forum, it's an event we produce in advance of each legislative session, and it focuses on critical budget issues, often pertaining to tax reform. Last week was no exception in that we showcased new research regarding economic well-being in Connecticut that underscored how a Connecticut child tax credit and Connecticut baby bonds can and will help provide virtuous cycles that advance racial and economic justice in our state. So let's get into it. Patrick, in 5 sentences or less, what are our 23rd Tax and Budget Forum reports about?
Hi, Emily. Thank you for the question. So our two tax and budget forum reports have three primary objectives. The first primary objective is to provide an overview of economic well-being to make clear both the level of support that Connecticut's families and children require and the urgency of providing that support. This includes highlighting Connecticut's inadequate income growth, high level of income inequality, substantial racial and ethnic income gaps, high rate of income poverty, an exceptionally high level of wealth inequality, substantial racial and ethnic wealth gaps, and a high rate of wealth poverty, all of which makes it difficult for many of Connecticut's families to make ends meet, especially families with children. The second primary objective is to provide an overview of the proposed Connecticut child tax credit, including the case for establishing the tax credit and a range of policy options. The case for establishing a well-designed state-level child tax credit is that, one, it'll support the economic well-being of Connecticut's low and middle-income families with children. Two, it'll help offset the reduction in federal support that contributed to a historic increase in child poverty. Three, it'll make Connecticut's tax system fairer. And four, it'll help to grow Connecticut's economy. Finally, the third primary objective is to provide an overview of Connecticut's baby bonds program, including its design and impact and policy options to improve the program. The key findings regarding the design and impact of Connecticut baby bonds are that, one, it'll support an estimated range of 12,460 to 15,140 newborns on average each year, which is equal to about 36.3% to 44.1% of all newborns in the state. Two, it'll support newborns in all 169 towns in Connecticut on average each year, including an average of at least 10% of newborns in 90% of the state's towns. Three, it'll have a maximum initial value of $3,200 per beneficiary, and will have an estimated real or inflation-adjusted value of $6,820 in 18 years and $11,290 in 30 years, which beneficiaries can use on a range of eligible expenditures. And four, it'll both directly and indirectly help to establish a more equitable distribution of wealth, and the direct impact alone is potentially substantial.
Terrific. Thanks for that, Patrick. At Connecticut Voices for Children, we believe justice is a horizon, not a destination. This is something I actually say a lot. And in service of providing some framing for these two reports, I thought it would be good to explain what is meant by this. In policy work, we don't talk about the journey nearly as much as we should because the journey is long and, quite frankly, filled with roadblocks. Honestly, most folks want to skip over talking about the hard work and go straight to celebrating the win. Most folks want to talk about the positive rather than the negative. And as a result, we've been trained to believe societally that a handful of policies here and there solve for really complicated problems. So, for example, that the right to vote solves civil rights issues, or that the passage of hundreds of millions of dollars for housing development solves housing affordability. But the truth is, the systemic issues that too many of us experience are centuries old. And since most people fear change and most lawmaking operates on election cycles, the numerous policies required to get to the actual solution of any one particular issue takes time. Now, to be clear, I'm all for celebrating the wins. I think it's absolutely important to be a cheerleader and claim victories when we can. But our North Star must be for exponential change that people are made aware of even while championing the incremental progress along the way. In other words, we can't know where we're going unless we know where we are and where we've been. That's why we elevate the disparities. And in today's conversation, we'll specifically be discussing income and wealth inequality and the impact of these disparities on Connecticut families. But we're also airing out these truths because to pretend that everything is great for everyone would be disregarding how many residents feel. Today, the vast majority of people feel that the economy isn't getting better, even though overall it is. The cost of gas and groceries, housing and healthcare, quality childcare and education feel overwhelming. And this is because they often are relative to one's ability to pay at the low and middle income brackets. So I think this is a good place to dig in more. Patrick, we presented a lot of new research on income and wealth inequality in Connecticut. Let's talk about income inequality first. What's happening on this front?
The report includes four key findings on the growth and distribution of income in Connecticut. The first key finding is that since the pandemic-induced recession, income growth really has failed to keep up with rising costs, reducing the standard of living for low and middle income households in Connecticut. Specifically, from 2019 through 2022, real household income in Connecticut decreased on average by 0.7% for low-income households and by 3.2% for middle-income households. And this has reduced the standard of living for low and middle-income households in Connecticut and is due primarily to the historic rise in the cost of living. Specifically measured using the Consumer Price Index, the cost of living increased by more than 15% from December 2019 to December 2022, which is the largest three-year increase since the 1980s. The second key finding is that Connecticut has a very high level of income inequality, with the top 1% of tax filers making $3.4 million a year, which is equal to 181.7 times the income of $18,800 for households of the 10th percentile. Additionally, some of the most prominent research-based explanations for the high level of income inequality in the U.S. include the rise of austerity macroeconomics, the decline of wage-setting institutions for low and mid-wage workers, the rise of skill-based technological change, increased globalization, and changes in household structure, all of which are summarized in the report. The third key finding is that Connecticut has substantial racial and ethnic income gaps, with the median Black and median Hispanic households earning 63 cents and 61 cents respectively for each dollar the median white household earns. Additionally, some of the most prominent research-based explanations include historical discrimination, including segregation, unequal access to high-quality education, and discrimination in the labor market. And the fourth key finding is that inadequate income growth, the high level of income inequality, and substantial racial and ethnic income gaps contribute to an overall child poverty rate of 11.1% in Connecticut, and an even higher rate for Black and Hispanic children, which is a major problem because poverty harms children in virtually every dimension of life, from physical and mental health to educational attainment and labor market success. Most notably, from 2021 to 2022, child poverty in Connecticut using the supplemental poverty measure jumped from 3.8%, or about 27,000 children, to 11.1%, or about 82,000 children, meaning child poverty in Connecticut more than doubled in a single year.
So, what I'm hearing you say is that since the pandemic induced recession, real household income in Connecticut has decreased for low and middle income families, which is largely a result of the historic rise in the cost of living. And in fact, it's the largest three-year increase since the 1980s. What's more, Connecticut's already high level of income inequality is exacerbating our state's racial and ethnic income gaps. And all of these things are contributing to the child poverty rate in Connecticut more than doubling from 2021 to 2022. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, that's a great summary.
And so, what about the state of wealth inequality in Connecticut? What's happening on this front?
Sure. So the report includes three key findings on the distribution of wealth, or net worth. The first key finding is that Connecticut has an even higher level of wealth inequality than income inequality, with an average estimated wealth of $48.3 million for the top 1% of families, compared to negative $1,800 for households at the 10th percentile. Additionally, two prominent research-based explanations for the exceptionally high level of wealth inequality in the U.S. include the high level of income inequality and the intergenerational transfer of wealth. More specifically, research shows that low-income families generally struggle to save and invest, limiting their accumulation of wealth. In contrast, high-income and wealthy families find it easier to save and invest, facilitating their accumulation of wealth. This dynamic also creates a feedback loop as increased wealth generates increased income, perpetuating and exacerbating both forms of economic inequality. Research also shows that, again, the transfer of wealth and its associated advantages through inheritance, gifts, and other mechanisms is a major driver of wealth inequality. The second key finding regarding wealth is that the Northeast, which includes Connecticut, has substantial racial and ethnic wealth gaps, with the median Black and median Hispanic households both averaging only 5 cents for each dollar in wealth for the median white household. And like wealth inequality in general, researchers have studied the causes of racial and ethnic wealth gaps. And some of the most prominent causes include historical discrimination, especially slavery and segregation, which limited the accumulation of wealth in the past and its transfer across generations. Additionally, ongoing racial and ethnic income gaps continue to limit the accumulation of wealth by reducing the ability to save and invest. These factors and others place a disproportionate percentage of Black and Hispanic families in the lower half of the wealth distribution, which then makes the exceptionally high level of wealth inequality especially harmful to those families. And finally, the third key finding is that an exceptionally high level of wealth inequality and substantial racial and ethnic wealth gaps contribute to an overall wealth poverty rate of 13.7% in Connecticut, and an even higher rate for Black and Hispanic households. And just for reference, wealth poverty in the reports is defined as when a household or family has zero or negative wealth because their liabilities equal or exceed their assets.
The top 1% of families have $48.3 million versus the families at the 10th percentile that have negative $1,800. I think for a lot of people, these data are really stunning. For others, especially if you're living with this data, what you're saying isn't at all surprising, but this Q&A is to help grow a broader understanding. So Patrick, for the folks listening in, why is it important for Connecticut to be intentional about income and wealth equity policies?
So great question. So first, income's the flow of money that a household or family receives over a given period of time. And it's essential to economic well-being because households and families use their income to pay for basic needs, pursue opportunities, and build a secure future while contributing to overall economic growth. Second, wealth or net worth is the total value of assets after subtracting liabilities, and it's essential to economic well-being because it provides a financial resource for unexpected expenses and allows households and families to maintain an adequate standard of living, especially during periods of unemployment or other economic hardships. So put in very simple terms, an equitable distribution of income and wealth is essential for making sure that all of Connecticut's children can thrive, and that at minimum requires that all children live in households that can make ends meet. In contrast, an inequitable distribution of income and wealth makes it difficult for many households, especially those with children, to make ends meet. For example, the report shows that in 2023, nearly 18% of households in Connecticut reported that it's very difficult to pay their usual expenses. And that rate increases to 27.6% for low and middle income households in Connecticut with children, 38.9% of Black households in Connecticut with children, and 32.2% of Hispanic households in Connecticut with children.
So the idea is that even though the economy overall is getting better, the cost of living for residents at the low and middle income brackets is still really high because the dollars just don't stretch as far as they used to. So if you're listening to this and wondering why political pundits talk about the economy getting better when you're barely able to get by, these are some of the reasons why. You're not imagining things. The struggle is very real. And so this is why we're calling for things to change. We think Connecticut should be more affordable for hardworking families. We believe that everyone who needs quality childcare should have access to affordable options. We believe that affordable housing should be available in every town across our state. We believe work should pay enough to live a dignified life, and that economic mobility is a reality, not just a dream. And the way we resource these opportunities is through income and wealth equity policies. Patrick, let's blow this out more for the people listening in. In what ways do income and wealth equity contribute to virtuous cycles of economic prosperity?
Sure. So a more equitable distribution of income and wealth will help to increase consumer spending growth and job growth, which will help to generate a positive feedback loop. As a faster growing economy will increase the state's budget capacity, and that'll make it possible to provide even more support for Connecticut's families and children while also managing the state's substantial debt. And so this requires a brief discussion of all three key components: consumer spending growth, job growth, and growth in budget capacity. So first, consider the increase in consumer spending growth. Consumer spending growth in Connecticut was slower than consumer spending growth in the US during the recoveries from the last two recessions. And this contributed to the state's slower economic growth because consumer spending accounts for nearly 70% of gross domestic product, or GDP, making it by far the most important component of economic growth. A more equitable distribution of income and wealth will therefore help to increase consumer spending growth in Connecticut through at least two pathways: a demand pathway in the short term and a supply pathway in the longer term. In the short term, a more equitable distribution of income and wealth will result in more direct financial support to low and middle income families with children, increasing their disposable income. And from an economic perspective, this is important because low and middle income families tend to spend a larger percentage of their additional income on goods and services. And in the longer term, a more equitable distribution of income and wealth will help to increase the number of consumers by making it more affordable for families to raise children in the state. It also helps to improve child development and educational outcomes by providing families with the resources they need to support their children's basic needs and invest in their education, leading to higher productivity and increased earnings potential. Next, consider the increase in job growth. So jobs are important because wages and salaries comprise the primary source of income for most families, and job growth is important because growth in wages and salaries is a major driver of GDP growth through increased consumer spending. And like consumer spending, job growth in Connecticut was slower than job growth in the US during the recoveries from the last two recessions, contributing to the state's slower economic growth. So establishing a more equitable distribution of income and wealth will help to increase job growth in Connecticut through at least two pathways: a demand pathway in the short term and a supply pathway in the longer term. In the short term, increased consumer spending will generate increased revenue for businesses, resulting in the hiring of more employees. And in the longer term, the increased supply of higher productivity workers will help start new businesses and grow existing businesses, resulting in more jobs. And lastly, consider the increase in budget capacity. So the increase in economic growth generated by the increase in consumer spending growth and the increase in job growth will increase the state's budget capacity through two pathways: increased spending cap capacity and increased tax revenue. So first, Connecticut's spending cap limits the growth in budget appropriations to the level in the preceding year, plus a percentage increase based on either the greater of two economic indicators: the increase in personal income or the increase in inflation. And in general, the increase in personal income is greater than the increase in inflation, making personal income generally the more important economic indicator. Additionally, the largest component of personal income is wages and salaries, and therefore the related increase in consumer spending and job growth will generate growth in personal income and in turn increase the state's spending cap capacity. Second, the increase in consumer spending and job growth will increase the state's tax revenues. And this will provide funding for further tax cuts for low and middle income families and increase public investments under the increased spending cap, contributing to what we call a positive feedback loop. It also help the state manage its substantial debt by decreasing the size of the debt in relation to the size of the nation's economy. And just to give an example to underscore how important Connecticut's economic growth is, consider that Connecticut's general fund would have realized an estimated $1.2 billion more in net tax revenue in fiscal year 2022 alone if the state's economic growth rate had simply tracked the growth rate for the US during the recovery from the pandemic-induced recession. Additionally, Connecticut's general fund would have realized an estimated $700 million more in net tax revenue in fiscal year 2022 alone if the state's growth rate had simply tracked the growth rate for New England during the recovery from the pandemic-induced recession.
So, in the most simplistic terms, the lack of equitable income and wealth policies are what allow poverty to persist and prevent economic mobility today. That's why the increased Connecticut earned income tax credit and Connecticut baby bonds are so important. And they're not enough, which is why we believe the state should enact a permanent Connecticut child tax credit. Patrick, what are the key recommendations we provide in our two reports?
So the overall key recommendation with the child tax credit is to provide a permanent, well-designed Connecticut child tax credit, and a well-designed Connecticut child tax credit would include some or all of the following key design and eligibility features: full refundability, no income floor, no income-based phase-in, and no cap on the number of children. A report that includes three specific state child tax credit options, and all three options would provide considerable support for Connecticut's families with children, though the third option would provide the most support for the lowest income families because it's 100% refundable, has no income floor, has no income-based phase-in, and has no cap on the number of children. The key recommendations for Connecticut baby bonds are grouped in 4 categories. So the first category is to provide immediate support for Connecticut's families and children, and this involves establishing a permanent, well-designed Connecticut child tax credit, which will help to ensure that beneficiaries of baby bonds are better positioned to take advantage of the program once they come of age. And the second, third, and fourth categories address options to improve the design of Connecticut baby bonds, ensure that the program and any improvements are sufficiently funded, and call for more information so that we're making the most of our First in the Nation program and also ensuring its sustainability beyond our lifetime.
Okay, great. So it sounds like we should unpack the child tax credit a little bit more. However, before we do, I want to be clear about our recommendations regarding Connecticut baby bonds. As a nation, if you think about President Lyndon Johnson's declaration back in 1964, we've been fighting the war on poverty for nearly 60 years. And today we're still fighting to protect many of the safety net policies that were enacted at that time, to say nothing of any movement on substantial wealth equity policies. So for a state, namely Connecticut, to pass this incredible generational wealth equity policy in the form of Connecticut baby bonds, this is a big deal. And the potential this policy has in moving the needle even further is why we published a report on this remarkable program. There are a number of states across the country right now that are looking to Connecticut as a model. And like a lot of policies, there are always ways that our programs can be strengthened. We are not saying that the program should be changed this year or next year or even 5 years from now. What we're saying is that we were the first state to do this, and being the first often means that everyone who follows benefits from the lessons learned, both good and bad. And so, what we're attempting to do is get in front of this and provide states seeking to implement their own initiatives some food for thought, especially for the states with limited resources. That, yes, the price tag is hefty, but as our research shows, it will make a real difference in closing racial and ethnic income and wealth divides. Connecticut baby bonds is in the initial implementation stages, and it should stay the course. It should learn from lessons from the rollout and the first few years that somebody else will probably study and refine it even more. And that's how great policy stays relevant. We were a big champion of this policy, and I'm so proud that we were able to do this in Connecticut. I think it's one of the best things the state has done. And like our advocacy for the policy, we're publishing this report because we care so deeply. But I want to pivot back to the Connecticut child tax credit, Patrick. What are the various options we're recommending the state consider, and what's the case we're making for why a state level child tax credit is so critical now?
So overall, the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA-based federal child tax credit in 2021 was a good model and had the following key design and eligibility features: full refundability, no income floor, no income-based phase-in, and no cap on the number of children. Along with the increase in the maximum amount of the tax credit, these key design and eligibility features contributed to the historic decrease in child poverty in 2021. In comparison to the ARPA-based child tax credit, the current Tax Cut and Jobs Act, or TCJA-based federal child tax credit, has the following key design and eligibility features: partial refundability, an income floor, an income-based phase-in, and a restriction on the amount of the tax credit available to families with 3 or more children. So along with the decrease in the maximum amount of the tax credit, these key design and eligibility features contributed to the historic increase in child poverty in 2022. So as an organization, we've been calling for a state level child tax credit since 2020, and our report updates a report that we published in 2022, making the case for a Connecticut child tax credit that is as simple as possible and has 4 key parts. First, it's fully refundable. For reference, a refundable tax credit is paid to a tax filer if it exceeds their income tax liability, whereas a non-refundable tax credit is capped by the amount of income tax liability. And this especially limits the size of the tax credit available to the lowest income families because they tend to have little or no income tax liability. Second, it has no income floor. An income floor is a minimum level of income below which a tax filer is not eligible for the tax credit, and this especially limits the size of the tax credit available to the lowest income families. Also, a tax credit that includes an income-based phase-in automatically has an income floor of at least $1 because any phase-in rate applied to no income is equal to 0. Third, a well-designed Connecticut child tax credit has no phase-in. An income-based phase-in increases the value of the tax credit as a tax filer's income increases, and this especially limits the size of the tax credit available to the lowest income families. And fourth, the most well-designed state child tax credit would have no cap, or if there is a cap, it's high enough to capture the majority of Connecticut's families. This is because having a cap on the number of children limits the number of tax credits that a tax filer can claim, unfairly burdening larger families. The report also highlights 3 other key policy option issues. So first, inflation indexing is essential to maintain the support of a state child tax credit over time. Second, a state child tax credit can be phased in over multiple years if necessary, and a 5-year phase-in proposal is provided for all 3 options in the report. And third, multiple funding options are available for the child tax credit, and they're also detailed in the report.
All right, so we're nearing the end of our time, which means there's just one last question, and that's in 3 sentences or less. Why should Connecticut residents and lawmakers care about the child tax credit and Connecticut baby bonds?
So at the simplest level, Connecticut residents and lawmakers should care about the state child tax credit and Connecticut baby bonds because these programs will provide substantial support for the state's low and middle income families with children, a large percentage of which are currently struggling to make ends meet. That increased financial support for low and middle income families with children will then help grow Connecticut's economy, which has grown substantially slower than both the US economy and even New England's economy. And as noted earlier, this process will help to generate a positive feedback loop because a faster growing economy will increase the state's budget capacity, both increase spending cap capacity and increase tax revenue. And that'll make it possible to provide even more support for Connecticut's families and children while also managing the state's substantial debt.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Patrick, and for your great work on these reports, and for joining me in today's Q&A. We started this conversation talking about justice being a horizon, not a destination, and I think it's fitting that we circle back on this. In short, when we say justice is a horizon, not a destination, what we're acknowledging is that the work is a process. It's imperfect, it's unfinished, and because time is both finite and fluid, it's never really complete, and that's okay, so long as we keep moving forward toward our North Star of exponential change. The fact of the matter is there is no perfect economy. What we're living with is a series of choices that people make and the results of those choices. The vast majority of decisions made over the decades tend to be better for capital than for workers. But we can create a better economy together. Thanks to the Connecticut General Assembly and Governor Lamont, we've got an incredible start with Connecticut baby bonds and an increased state level EITC. The enactment of a permanent Connecticut child tax credit would help root and grow even more families and let them know that our state understands the needs of the plurality. Thanks for tuning in to our Just Research Q&A. Connecticut Voices for Children is a research and advocacy organization. At Voices, we believe that every funding and every policy decision should lead us to the future we want, which is a fair and just society where all Connecticut children reach their full potential. Our issue areas center research-backed policies that eradicate poverty and advance family economic security. If this better world sounds good to you, we invite you to join the movement by signing up for our email list or making a donation. Links to do both can be found on our website at ctvoices.org.